Welcome to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode, we feature James Peyer and Juliette Hahn of Cambrian Biopharma.
That's great. Thanks, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. And we are thrilled that you're here with us this week. We have two amazing guests in James and Juliette from Cambrian Bio, and we're going to learn all about how they founded Cambrian, where it's going, what they're working on. But first, I'm going to take a point of personal privilege and encourage you all to join us on Wednesday for our second annual Patient Engagement Summit. We'll put the link to register in the chat, but we're talking with a number of patients and patient advocates, as well as physicians on Wednesday to talk about things that impact the patient community. So we really hope you'll join us. It's really important that we engage with the patient community throughout the things that we do. With that, as always, housekeeping. I know you're going to have questions for James and Juliette today, so please put those in the Q&A or the chat, and Derek and I will get to them as we go through the course of our discussion. With that, I'm going to kick it over to Derek to start our conversation. Thanks, everyone.
All right, good morning, James, Juliette. It's fantastic for both of you to be here. Really, this has everything. In addition to mug discussions, we have a fantastic founding story. You guys are probably, I think, one of the most exciting startup stories in and around New York City. You've raised $160 million for Cambrian. You guys got to present at our emerging company showcase, and we get to talk about all things ecosystem, longevity, science, new business models, and everything. So I'm excited for this morning. Before we get to all of that, I think it would be good for both of you to start with a little bit of an origin story. Why don't you talk a little bit about kind of how you got to basically putting Cambrian together, how you both got there, and we'll get the ball rolling.
Sure. Maybe I can kick off with that, Derek.
I think that works. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, with two of us here, probably the simplest way to do it is I'll give a little bit of background and I'll kick it over to Juliette to talk a little bit about how she got here. And then I'll kind of like pull those two threads together to try to explain a little bit of like what Cambrian is and how we got started.
Sounds good.
So my background is as a scientist. I did a PhD in stem cell biology. But the through line of my entire adult life actually is this fascination with the idea that we should be using our knowledge of biology to prevent disease instead of react to it. And so that started for me with a fascination with cancer biology. And this phrase that I heard, like the more I learned about oncology, the more I started hearing this phrase that the goal of a cancer doctor is to keep a patient alive long enough that they die of something else. And like we had kind of given up the torch of like a cure for cancer because it was just too complex a disease and too hard to do that. And I found that like live long enough to die of something else phrase just like almost personally repugnant. And I was like, there has to be a different way to do this. And that led me to this fascinating area of research that we now call like geroscience, or the studying of what makes us age. And what scientists had shown there is that there were a bunch of different ways to tweak a gene or provide a new drug that targets one of these things we call the drivers of aging in mice to extend healthy lifespan of mice, of a mammal. But these hadn't been translated from animal to human studies. And so I'll touch more on that in a second, but like that was the trigger that was like, oh, if we could find a system to take this litany of interesting discoveries around the biology of aging and put them into a translational framework that could allow them to fit into a biotech company that would make sense today, that could be a really huge idea. And so as I was learning the biotech world, I had started a venture capital firm that was kind of like the first group to build companies around this aging biotech space. And that kind of founded and ran a few companies through that venture firm. But then the opportunity was so much bigger than we expected it would be that I needed to find a way to capture more of these interesting discoveries under one umbrella with a bigger platform to develop it. So moved from Europe back to New York to start Cambrian. And I came and knocked on the door of one of my mentors. I had been at McKinsey for a little while, and I knocked on the door of one of my mentors that had kind of helped me find my footing at McKinsey, and I knew was like an extremely brilliant scientist and organization designer, and that was Juliette. And I begged her to come join Cambrian in its very earliest days with me. So Juliette, with that,
that's a good segue right there.
Yeah, no, excellent, great. Definitely. So my background also academically is in the sciences. I have my PhD in neuroscience, and I was always enamored by how unlimited questions you can ask, right? And then you have the questions, and you have to and then you'll never get the satisfaction of getting a satisfactory answer, probably in our lifetime even, unless our longevity thing really works out and our lifetime is so much more expanded on what answers we can get. But ultimately after my PhD, I did leave academia and joined McKinsey, where I did meet James. Learned a ton, learned a lot, as people, many of you maybe have been familiar with consultants around commercialization, some of the M&A deals, et cetera. And then after that, though, I left and went to finance. I went to both public and private side of finance. And I was just at the time really cared a lot about working with high performance people. I wanted to learn how to build really high performing teams, elite teams. And I love the rigor and the stamina it takes as you guys know, that in New York to survive in a finance world. And I just loved all of it. And at some point though, I was mulling over, all these skills I'm learning and all the actually even industry best practice that finance brings, right? Like how risk modeling, risk management, portfolio modeling, construction, team building, and this agile state of that industry, how could I apply that to something more meaningful to me, which is going back to the academic aspects and perhaps science. And I guess stars align, and that's when James says begs. But I mean, in retrospect, James he doesn't know this, but he didn't have to twist my arm that hard. I mean, it's just around that time I was thinking, I feel like I want to be more passionate about the problem I'm solving and people I'm working with, and be more mission driven. And about that time is when James and I our paths crossed again, and here we are working on something great and amazing that we want to tell you more about today.
Well, keep going. Oh, sorry, jump in, James.
Yeah. I was gonna say, so I can frame a little bit then, I think, with that setup of like what Cambrian is. So I always like to conceive of startups in like how many difficult balls they're trying to keep in the air at the same time. How many balls they have to juggle, and like simple companies try to juggle one ball at a time. Companies that are going to fail try to juggle 5 balls at a time. Cambrian is trying to juggle 2 balls at one time, and the idea is that in order to justify becoming a little bit more complex as a company, you have to have a reason to have both of those balls in the air at the same time. And so the 2 aspects that you kind of heard about from us is, number one, this focus on a new type of science around this biology of aging, or this geroscience aspect. And then the second is to try to build a risk diversified portfolio model that kind of combines the best pieces of a startup biotech company, a venture building kind of fund, and a big pharmaceutical company. And so we can get into a little bit of this, but I just wanted to give kind of 2 or 3 points of like a rationale for why we structured it this way, kind of based on what I saw in the first venture fund that I was building, and sort of in this ecosystem, which applies both to the science of aging and its translation, but I think also to biotech more broadly. Did you want to jump in, Jennifer?
Yeah, James, what made you, as an investor, right? You're in a different seat. What made you say, wait, I think I need to go and do this to actually execute on solutions rather than just investing in other people's solutions?
So it was a combination of 2 things, really, right? One was that private venture investors like to talk about themselves as being long-term, and they are compared to public market investors that have to move day to day and quarter to quarter. But on the scale of drug development, they're really not, right? Every VC really wants to see value inflection milestones, then figure out how to get their company acquired or take it public, and then ultimately divest their shares from that. So long term for them is like 3 to 5 years in a good situation, 6 to 7 years in like a, kind of butt clenching, like, oh God, sort of situation. And for what we wanted to do, kind of the overall strategy we wanted to apply to this health span extension space involves a two-step dance in clinical trials, where you have to first find an existing disease to do safety and efficacy trials with and kind of build your commercial case around these drugs, and then do prevention afterwards. So after you have safety and efficacy, do like what the statins did and start going for primary prevention to extend health span, prevent diseases. And what I saw is that you couldn't do this in a company that had, or from a seat that had venture timelines, because those companies would systemically underinvest in the long-term prevention angle of it. So we had to make something that could take a longer viewpoint while still adding value on those venture type milestones. That's the big one. And then number two, which I'll mention really briefly, is that I felt like the business models of venture, there's something uncomfortable to me about needing to go around raising money around a single idea and waving the flag and saying like, this is the next greatest thing, right? This drug is going to work. You should invest in it because of X, Y, Z. And so I wanted to figure out how not to raise money around individual hypotheses, which I feel are systemically overclaimed in the fundraising world, and instead raise around a pool of assets or a pool of programs whose risks are more soberly determined and communicated to have alignment between a management group and an investor group. So I think those are the two big pieces.
If you think about it, any of the venture groups that actually engage in company creation around single asset companies, which are fine, but no venture group just does one of them, right? At some point you have a basket in a portfolio. It might not be within the individual company. The individual company might be a single asset company, but there's no way the venture fund would basically put all of its risk in a single asset company. You need to diversify at some level.
And so if we wanted to take kind of a cynical view on that, like these venture builders are achieving diversification through creating a bunch of different assets, but then those assets are individually, the risk is transferred onto investors that may be less diversified later on down the line. And the idea originally was at that point you have much more mature companies that have much more easy to quantify success stories. But as the biotech industry has been sending companies public earlier and earlier and earlier, I don't think that that's actually the truth anymore.
Okay, so a challenging question then. So it's not like your company can exist without capital, right? Actually, this means you need more of it. So you really have two challenges here, right? The first is you need a lot of capital, so you have to get other people on board with this story that, like you said, there's an intermediate step, which frankly probably doesn't have the type of venture returns that people would want. And then there's a super risky step, right? So you have the model challenge, and you also have the challenge of, well, gosh, no one's done this before, right? So how do you approach those conversations? How do you get past the point in the conversation, not so much about the model, but the fact that everyone who's attempted to do it before has failed, or longevity by, almost by definition in the word is out in the future, which does not help investors with their returns in the near term.
So I could touch on this maybe in 2 seconds, and then I would pass it off to Juliette. The big decision that we made was to set the value of this longevity idea to zero in the way that we think about the value of the company. That we only value Cambrian based upon the initial diseases that we will be treating inside an established regulatory structure. I don't know if you want to expand on on that piece, Juliette. But like,
So,
yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to underestimate the challenge that is fundraising for any startup founder, right? I mean, especially these few months it's been for the entire industry. And certainly we've been very lucky to have raised the funds that we did so far, and then knock on wood, we'll continue to do so. But when we approached these model designs with the investors, it was really a no-brainer for them. Actually, what you point out are maybe things somewhat in some people's mind, some people have done and failed, et cetera. And I feel like we are really benefiting from not being the first people to try this. Actually, we have learned so much and science has progressed so much that we are taking the best practice we've seen from whether it be pharmaceuticals having done their corporate venture capital, traditional venture capital, doing their management strategy across the dispersion of the risks, or private equity doing operational control to make sure that their high ticket items are as valuable as they can grow them, or whether it be through academia, how having the best scientists to advance the hypothesis is really for the greater good and the outcome. And when we tell this story to the investors and say, look, we're not a venture fund, we are like there is an appeal of a traditional R&D biotech investment to the investors and how they want to tell that story, right? But you don't have to risk that funds going into one asset. You are dispersing your capital across, we're at 16 today, we'll be, 30, 40, and some years down the road. Those assets in the long run, and then those, you don't have to wait for everything to commercialize. We have very flexible strategy for the best outcome of individual programs. Right. And then we also are able to now not only disperse risk, but disperse talent, which is a huge selling point. As you guys know, hiring is always a challenge, especially when you're hiring top caliber scientists and executive team that is so required for a biotech to be successful. Now, when you're a single asset small biotech, that becomes even more challenging, right? You have to find these experts with 20, 30 years of experience, because drug making is not something you can learn from a textbook and be entrepreneurial around that, right? You do need this serious expertise. Now, what we're able to do is convince these caliber of folks to come on board, because not only do they head up one asset where that might be an opportunity that they might be courted for, here they can set the strategy of multiple assets very early, be hands-on, and then share across these expertise. So in many ways, I'm happy to tell you more about that as well, but in many ways, this type of attributes of our model have been so compelling to our investor base, who are looking for this type of diversification, as well as agility, as well as long-term growth plan with high caliber talent. It's been a positive for us all around.
Yeah. So we have a question from the audience that I think dovetails nicely into one thing that might be useful. So you talk about kind of molecular hallmarks of aging and places where these compounds might have some immediate applications. So Dave Kalo asked about somebody that was working on advanced glycosylation end products, or AGEs. I was familiar with that much more in the diabetes realm that cause tons of complications. So his question is, are those still important? But I thought it would be good to expand it and say, what are some of the areas that you're looking at? Because I think when people think longevity, you think about things, I tend to think about things like Alzheimer's, I tend to think about things like degradation, but maybe you could give a couple of examples of the types of sciences that you're looking into.
Sure, yeah. So the watershed moment for this field that kind of really started its path from academic research to translational biology and drug discovery was a review paper that was published in 2013 called The Hallmarks of Aging, which was borrowed from the, I think it was 2000 or 2001 paper, The Hallmarks of Cancer, that kind of pulled together all of these different pieces and was like, oh, here's what cancer needs in order to work. And then this was like, here are 9 features that change as we age. And prior to that point, academics had kind of been feuding with each other about whose hallmark was actually responsible for aging. And Believe it or not, yeah. And then this this review kind of put a truce, or no, a shaky truce, but a truce around a lot of those academic squabbles that were happening, and saying, hey, look, it's actually all of these things. And if you look at the data in totality, like all of these different changes that are happening with aging are contributing to this sort of systems collapse phenotype that happens. And so fast forward a few years to Cambrian, and we took these 9 hallmarks of aging and broke them down into a little bit more mechanistic focused categories that we call the drivers of aging. And this includes things like AGEs would be part of our driver of aging, called changes in aggregates in the extracellular matrix, right? And so we actually have a series of plays involving changes that happen, like permanent crosslinks or modifications that build up in the ECM that accumulate as we age, that contribute to vicious cycles, kind of like negative feedback loops of inflammation and senescence, where the ECM is feeding back into cells, and then cells are then driven to produce unhealthy ECM and these factors that enhance loops that eventually lead to fibrosis, which causes all sorts of problems down the line.
Yes.
So that's actually a good example, because we actually have, depending on how you count it, 3 or 4 programs running in that general theme of changes to the ECM, which we felt like was one of these spaces that, unless you look at ECM in the context of overall aging, and not just like in NASH or in pulmonary fibrosis or in kidney disease, you fail to appreciate what's going on organismally, because there are all of these shared processes that happen across tissues. So that's I think a really nice example. And another one that that I think is a good example of this is there are some transcriptional pathways that are just involved in a bunch of different features that all relate to aging. And the most well-known of these is the mTOR pathway, where this drug rapamycin has been shown to robustly extend health span and lifespan of animals, and has also been tried in over 2,000 clinical studies in humans to treat or prevent a bunch of different diseases, where there's this dramatic sign of efficacy for this drug, but it has an extremely thin therapeutic window, because it induces immune suppression and causes stomatitis or infection susceptibility. And so it's been sort of a dream of people working in this space for a long time. Could we make an mTOR inhibitor that didn't have some of these downsides? And working with a team at Novartis, we pulled in a series of compounds that we think may solve that particular challenge. So those are 2 of, like Juliette said, more than a dozen examples that we have under Cambrian.
So you and your new subsidiary, right, is Tornado Therapeutics?
That's right.
Why that name?
So I love naming stuff, and you know, it's fun to get a little fun with biotech names. So the reason is actually, number one, there's sort of a tradition in the mTOR field to do punny names that include Tor in the name. One of the other companies that was created by Polaris in this space, like almost 10 years ago now, is called Navitor.
Okay.
And so, you know, we wanted to keep the Tor part in there. And then very much by chance, I think the name came to us because we have a company that is still in stealth mode, so I can't say anything about what it's working on, but called Cyclone, that we'll be able to announce sometime later. So we can have Cyclone and we can have Tornado, and they are kind of like a little bit related to each other on a mechanistic level.
I'm sensing all the new Cambrian subsidiaries. Well, you're going for terrible weather in your
you're going to have to be careful from a branding perspective. If you get into all these national disasters, right, you're going to either be, you know, IPOing, or you're going to have a big clinical trial, and then there's going to be a disaster somewhere, and it's just going to be a PR nightmare.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think is happening in the biotech space anyway, that people are having more and more fun
Fun, yes.
with
Yes.
their
Yeah.
names around this. I think we just saw Pretzel Therapeutics get announced
Mhm.
recently, and then there was like Werewolf that went public last year with its ticker
Yep.
sign Howl,
Oh.
which was a big thing, and it's just fun.
Okay. And now we have people suggesting names in the chat, which is, how about Tor, the god of tundra? Okay. So before we completely
Derail the
go
conversation.
off the rails, you might want to kind of pull this back slightly.
Yeah, we actually had a
Go
good
ahead.
question before we totally get off of sort of the founding. We had a question from the audience. It says, James, your career seems to be the opposite of many, especially scientists who become VCs and then at the end of their career become investors. You flipped it and you were an investor much earlier in your career. And so the basic question is, how did you learn enough about business at an early age to move over to the VC world?
Yeah, so I made the mistake, if we want to call it that, of going through my undergraduate and graduate work having never taken an economics or business class at all. But from the time I was about 16, I had this idea that I was going to be involved in starting companies to build drugs to do something about aging. And so I actually started a business while I was an undergraduate, which I didn't know anything about drug discovery at the time. So it was a business that worked on science education, bringing genetic engineering into high schools. And it was like, I would call it a great learning success, not a great economic success. We were the first company to raise a biotech company to raise money through Kickstarter, which was a brand new platform at that time. And we worked with a couple of local universities to get these lab kits where we did PCR and kind of genetic engineering in high schools to about half the schools in about half the states. And that was really fun. And we did it with no VC funding. It was kind of like I was working in the lab at the time and was buying PCR machines to ship to these schools on eBay with the money I was making washing glassware as an undergraduate. And it was just a great learning experience. And then that grew and grew and kind of got a little bit bigger where VCs started approaching us. And I had to make the decision, okay, do we want to shut this thing down to focus on my PhD, or do I want to become an education, a science education entrepreneur as a career path? And I decided the former, that I still had this dream of working in drug development. And so I got a little bit, I had to read an awful lot to kind of get up to speed on how the business side of things worked there. Yeah. But then I also think that the short stint that I spent as a consultant at McKinsey was pretty transformative for me, where it's I had these ideas of how drug development in the aging space should work, these strategies that were kind of coalescing during my academic stint. And then after a little while at McKinsey, I was able to kind of put the pieces together on how this whole portfolio business thing should work. So that's an incomplete answer, but I think those were the two elements.
And then Juliette, similar question for you, right? Because you have a neuroscience background, PhD, and then you went into what I would even consider, Citadel, right? Non-scientific finance. So tell us a little bit about how you figured out where you wanted to ultimately be at Cambrian.
Yeah, so I definitely didn't stay all the way in-house on the scientific side for long, but ultimately I think of it as learning how to cook. First of all, I'm not a great cook at all, but I envision this is how it feels like when you become a chef. The thing about becoming a chef, it's with anyone who's top of their field, you becoming an expert. But not only are you an expert, you have your own style, right? Your own cuisine. So if I liken the process in my own thinking that way, I thought, look, ultimately in the beginning stages of my career, I wanted to learn the right fundamental skills that's going to carry me through. Now it comes with what you want to do in your life, but I wanted to, becoming a company builder, people leader, all those type of things that is on my path to hopefully do something great in the science and drug making world. And in that, I thought it didn't really matter to me ultimately the first few years where I learned it. It was important that I learned it in the most strenuous, rigorous way possible. And some of that just happened to be in finance, right? They are really good at performance measurements and making sure that everything is very rigorously done. Analytics are highest part, right? They move fast. And for me, it was, I don't think that I took it as like, everything's a process, everything's a step. Where can I learn these types of attributes that's going to make me a great leader? And taking a leap, for instance, to join HR at Citadel. And people thought that was, people underestimate how important HR is in performance in a company. Yeah. And I wanted to take an opposite bet and say, I'm going to become an expert at it. I'm going to be really good at it. And I'm going to become a person who can really think about HR in a strategic way, because no matter what, you can, if you want to build a great team, great company, that's something you have to know how to do. And then where else can you learn that best than some of the highest performing, the finance firms, right? Right. So those are the types of bets I really genuinely enjoyed. And I thought ultimately in my career, if it's going to be multi-decade bet I take on myself, then I want to make sure I'm training for that marathon in a systematic manner. So that's what really guided my personal decisions on what I wanted to do. And then I am now at a point of in the becoming a chef field, thinking about what kind of cuisine I like to really apply my skills towards. And it just happens to be in the drug development world, in this case, building Cambrian, me being the cuisine that I wanted to take a bet on as something I wanted to start applying my skill sets towards.
Okay, so Juliette, I'm going to run with your cooking analogy here. So in the middle of cooking every dish, sometimes things don't go the way you expect them to. So over the last little bit, you guys had a great plan. You've got a vision. What are some of the things that you kind of had to improvise on? Some of the things that didn't go the way that you thought they would, or some of the things that are more challenging than you thought they would be? And I'm desperately trying to think of a specific recipe-laden thing where you screw up something very easily and the whole dish falls apart. But this is not MasterChef; it's a virtual breakfast series in biotech. So we'll just go with the biotech angle.
Anything with baking, right? Feels like the apropos analogy there. I don't know, Juliette, do you want to take that one first? I have too many stories.
Oh yeah, I mean, I know James and I are probably grinning because like, what hasn't been challenging, right? When you're starting a company that starts other companies and they're all building at the same time. Okay. So it's been.
We'll pick COVID the easiest one. What went the most wrong? What was the biggest thing where we're completely outside of what your expectations were, threw you for a loop? What's the biggest challenge you've had to face so far?
James, it seems like you have one right at the tip of your tongue. If not, I have, yeah.
Sure, I can definitely jump in with this one. So in building a big pipeline of early stage assets, one of the things that we could do as an investor is that you could sit on top of a bunch of companies where scientists had already pulled the foundational IP out of their university. And you could just put money into this little IP holding entity that had been created, right? We have now 19 different drugs under development at Cambrian, which means we had to do all of these different licensing agreements from all of these different tech transfer offices around the world, right? And there's this. First of all, it just takes way longer than you would ever anticipate. So we started out saying, okay, well, we've got a scientist on board with us. We know what we want to do with this asset. Like, all we need to do is knock on the door of a tech transfer group, make a fair offer and sign some papers. And we would get the offer that we made, but it would take about 12 months instead of 1. And that was, I think, the first big lesson from this is we have to start way earlier in these discussions on the business side. So we almost rebuilt a business development or an asset acquisition strategy from the ground up based on how long it took to really go from 0 to 1 with new assets. I think that was the biggest challenge to get this right, because we had such an aggressive plan for planting all of these seeds around early stage science that could slowly be cultivated from the preclinical and then into the clinical stages. but moving that fast on so many different fronts while we were still a really young company, damn, that was hard.
Yes, that sound you hear is every single person that has ever licensed anything from academia nodding along in unison with you. And, you know, having had a number of tech transfer folks on this program, it's not because they're unreasonable, and it's not anything really to do with that. It just takes a long time. But yes, I do love that your initial estimate was a month. That would have been pretty exciting.
Optimistic.
Look,
pretty good.
Entrepreneurial optimism, right?
Yeah.
Entrepreneurial optimism, sure. So we have go ahead,
Juliette?
Juliette.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I mean, my thing is going to be, challenge is going to be related to that. It's quite a humbling experience. So once you close this deal, right, you're like, it's great, we're going to do this great science. And you realize that all the other things that's going to continue to exist. And then that includes, especially in our structure, things like accounting, legal, finance, and then it is a multi-entity complex structure. So bringing all of that together is going to be, it is technically challenging, and for a good reason, right? The government wants to make sure that you're doing it correctly, and all the auditors want to make sure that you're not going to get in trouble. Like, everyone's doing their part to make sure that we're going to grow the right way, because we want to grow the right way and make sure our future is flexible, right? For whatever endeavors we want to do. So we wanted to put an institutional infrastructure early and hold ourselves to that high bar from year one. And that means that many people, many cooks in the kitchen having ideas on what we should do. Now, for, again, a good reason of wanting to make sure that we left no stones unturned. And I think there was, while we recognize the need to do that and how important that was in the beginning, I think we are constantly figuring out how much more complex and volume of work there is on that arena, especially in such a regulated industry like ours. So that's something that we're continuing to learn. We're trying to continue to simplify as much as possible in our model. But that is a very much an exciting aspect of the company building.
So we have another quick question here, blocking and tackling a little bit. It said, does the Cambrian team have their own, lab space and scientists, or do you do work mostly via CROs? So since we're thinking about kind of ecosystem stuff, we could talk a little bit about New York here. What does your lab footprint look like, and how do you think about scaling the organization?
I can jump on that one first, because this was sort of one of my principles coming into building the company, was that biotech in general has been moving from a physical to a virtual management structure, right? And that's one of the things that allows a model like ours to exist. Like, I spent my entire day on Zoom way before it was cool. And so, I think a lot of this is driven by the big trend that the large pharma companies are continuously downsizing their early stage R&D features in favor of outsourcing more of it in a more flexible way and directing more of those resources towards M&A opportunities. And that has led to this immense talent pool of early stage drug developers that have gone to find permanent, stable homes at really fantastic CROs. And so we think of our sort of lab capabilities in three ways. So let me first say, we don't have our own dedicated lab space, and that was very much intentional. We have a bunch of CRO relationships where a lot of the specialized work gets done, but then we also we are also huge believers in continuing work at academic labs where science got started and all of these assays are already set up. So a company for Cambrian is never just like a sponsored research agreement and like some academics working on a bench. It's always more than that, but almost always it includes that as a part. And when things are really complex, we then build out some lab space in like the close proximity to that academic institution that we started something in, so that they can work closely together. And that's sort of the three-part pattern that we've used. And I think that actually informs very much why we chose to be in New York instead of Boston, Like, I didn't want to ever have lab space for Cambrian, but I wanted to be at an international hub where we had access to talent that could do this, that was used to this sort of international look at like virtual management, which is very in theme for how biotech has often, biotech and finance actually have worked in New York. And then kind of the second piece of it is that we wanted to be a place where everyone, wherever you were in West Coast, East Coast, South, middle of the country, could all descend on our headquarters really quickly and seamlessly as a place that everybody wanted to go. And I like Boston, but I like New York better.
We're gonna repeat that.
I'm gonna cut that quote out and just use it as the single. That's the one piece that we can put anywhere. That's good.
So more of
the
traditional sort of the hub and spoke, right? Where you've got easy access.
That's right.
You know, and we found that even last year when we were doing things, you all were great participants in our emerging company New York Stock Exchange showcase in December, but we also did one in June, and we focused on European companies because we found that New York is a natural landing place for, you know, people and companies coming into the US, right? Because they often have consular offices and they have relationships here. So we've found that to be really interesting. We actually had another question here about sort of the model, right? The Cambrian model. And they had questions about the two-step model. It says it said, this one is general. Investors are in quotes, for step one only. As founders, how do you manage the risk that the board will never invest in step two? And then we have another one. So the second piece of that is specific to the Cambrian model. It says, can you find drugs that treat some tractable condition you can successfully repurpose for prevention and longevity? And are there any real world examples of this where the prevention / longevity has been proven and is marketed that way?
Do you want me to start, Juliette, on the kind of like fundraising board two-step piece? And yeah, so the short version there is we have to manage it carefully. So a large fraction of our biggest investors were selected based on their buying in to both stages of this dance, right? And so I co-founded Cambrian with Christian Angermeyer, who runs a family office out of London, and is like, his personal mission in life is to have people live happier, longer, healthier lives. And his capital is in there for the long term, and he's, you know, one of the largest shareholders in the business. And like our Series A was led by a fund that was like, oh, we want to make long-term bets. This group called Future Ventures that instead of creating a 10-year fund, created a 15-year fund, one of the first of its kind, so they could take longer bets. And, you know, so we brought a group of people on board that were bought into the mission. We've actually turned down more capital into Cambrian than we've accepted so far. But then the second piece of it that's, I think, a little bit more practical is that a company and its mission can be preserved past its initial investors by eventually going public. And that kind of liquidity event without being acquired is the sort of thing that allows a company to have a through line of its long-term mission while giving investors liquidity options along the way, where they can, you know, even if the VCs are fully aligned, they might want to return some of that capital back to their limited partners in a reasonable time frame, and we want to be a good investment to those folks from that perspective.
And just because you quote valued part two as zero doesn't mean that there's not value to those investors that's not on a balance sheet.
In fact, that's why we value it at zero, because we say, look, if we're right, then, like, first of all, if we valued it as non-zero, the value of Cambrian today would be so big, even if you applied a really tiny risk percentage to our ability to create these preventative drugs. Like, they're going to be such a big market if they're successful that Cambrian should be valued way more than it is today. And so the idea is, like, if we're successful, we're going to do great. our early investors are going to do great, and investors coming on with us today are going to do great.
Yeah.
And so we just don't have to price that into the existing value of the company.
Right.
And it also,
Right.
Jennifer, comes down to like really good long-term planning for us, right? So knowing that there is a second step. How many of us have probably run experiments and said, oh, I should have, added these more read points or more samples, like then I could have done it with like incremental, effort, and we could have learned so much more. And there is absolutely that type of thinking that we do. So when we design all of our milestones and R&D milestones and things that we have to get done, there's always this hypothesis that we're forming in the back and say, what can we do to learn the most and the best about the mechanisms of aging, right? Because for us, this isn't just like a finite one disease play, right? So like we're really a company endeavoring to further the knowledge and progress how we understand aging as a society. So with that perspective, even if it's not a 1-2 step, it's really how can we make sure that we're doing our part to have this impact in learning the mechanisms of aging, even if this asset doesn't work out, right? There is a failure rate, but what can we do to make sure that all of our hypotheses and designs and protocols are structured in such way that we have the maximum learning from that on the scientific front? So if we think of everything that way, and we do, and that's how we're set up to do, and that's how our teams are encouraged to think, then the ultimate outcome is going to help us learn that. So it's not, even though it's a 1-2 step business wise, scientifically, we hope that it's not such like a big leap. And we're taking advantage as we move along to step 1 of learning everything we can to set us up for success for step 2.
It's an iterative process that is
absolutely.
Yeah.
This is another good segue. So we've had a couple of questions in the flavor of, what should people be doing now, right? So I kind of wanted to blend this into really kind of the patient and consumer side of things. So number 1, what are some of the things that you see people doing now that are useful from a lengthening health span perspective? And number 2, where do you see either the consumer or the patient understanding of this field going in the next 5 or 10 years? Because there's a bit of culture that needs to also happen for people to accept and have it be normal to try and it shouldn't come out of the blue for the stuff that you're doing that would change our lives, right? So could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So let me just say that my organizing thesis here is that we don't know the answer to almost all of these questions about what actually can work today to extend healthy lifespan, simply because no one is running the appropriate clinical trials to do it. Because running the right trials is extremely hard. And it's one of the reasons that we created Cambrian the way we did, was to build an organization, a for-profit organization that can justify running these types of trials. And so as we think about like what this is going to look like in the future, there's like a little bit of a futuristic element to it, but then there's also a little bit of like a more mundane element that draws on established precedent here. And so capturing both of these pieces is key. So I'll start with the precedent side of this. So we already have drugs that are approved today as primary preventatives, or where you identify people who are at high risk, for example, someone who has high cholesterol, and then they take a drug to lower their cholesterol to help them lower the risk of heart disease and stroke, right? That's an established paradigm that already exists. And so by tweaking the formula a little bit, saying, hey, we're going to measure a different suite of biomarkers, and we have a new drug that we can design a clinical trial and hopefully show in a trial that this reduces not just risk of heart disease, but also cancer, metabolic disease, neurodegeneration, all of these things in the same time with the same suite of mechanisms. That's not that big of a change. And if you go out and you do like policy polling and it's like, oh, would you take a drug that prevents cancer and Alzheimer's and heart disease at the same time? Everyone says yes. Right. Then the more futuristic element of this is like, how is our knowledge of biology going to change the way that we live, right? Like, what does a society look like if we can use medical technology to enhance our average life expectancy from 80, where it is right now, to 100 or higher? And that's a question that's far enough out in the future that it doesn't really impact our tactical planning here as we're building a business, but it is an interesting one to pay attention to and just kind of like provide some commentary on here and there. The only thing I would say about it in the context of this, casual discussion is like, we have a demographic shift that's happening around the world where this measurement, or this KPI that I'm obsessed with, called the old age dependency ratio, the number of working age people, the number of old people divided by the number of working age people, is going up. So we're having way more old people per working age person, and
Right.
that ratio is going to increase 5-fold from the start of 2000, so the start of this century to the end of this century. 5-fold. Goes from about 1 in 10 to 2 in 10. Sorry, 1 in 10 to 5 in 10. One old person per 10 young people to 5 old people per 10 young people. And that's going to do a crazy thing to the economy unless we can figure out how to keep people over 65 healthy. And so I think it's just sort of this like worldwide looming crisis that we have to think about. But that's the long-term part.
You just dump that there.
Yeah.
We're going to have economic Armageddon if we continue on this path. And on to the next topic.
Yeah.
We could spend a lot longer than an hour talking about that one, I imagine.
Yeah. Juliette, you were going to jump in?
Yeah.
I mean, I was just going to add that, look, ultimately, though, before we can say how would the consumers respond, or general population or government, it has to be knowledge-led first, right? I mean, one of the things that first got me into neuroscience, aside from never-ending list of to-dos for a lifetime, is that there was also this. I studied developmental neuroscience, and there was, you realize that people, especially in poorer parts of the world, really don't understand congenital disorders, right? Like autism and schizophrenia, even they attribute it to something else, like something extra worldly, I guess.
Right.
And why is that? It's because we don't have a good explanation that's easily palpable, graspable, and then also a cure. So people think if you know the problem, you should have a solution, right? So without that, it's easy, myself included, to like put your head in the sand and say like, well, we'll deal with it when we get there, because there's a lot of current crisis constantly looming. So I think the first question we have to answer will be, if the question is why do we age and how can we, live more healthfully, is provide an answer and say, this is why we age and this is how you can live more healthfully longer. Then once that is a reality, right, even that you can no longer deny, then as society, we can, grapple around that and then like try to group ourselves together. Obviously, in the ideal world, we prepare ourselves for the long term and build for the long term, but we haven't done that historically as well as I wish we would. But I have no doubt that no matter what it is, we'll make it work and we'll improve upon it. This is not the first revolution or evolution of any type in mankind history, and I'm sure this is next one will be a next challenge that people will continue to evolve on. But I do think that the first primary endeavor for us is to provide solutions, in this case, scientific, and then encourage and share out our solutions so that society can better prepare for how it's changing. And we are very grateful to have a part in that.
James?
Maybe
James, you're raising your hand, but you can just go.
Oh no, I'm just I do this thing when I don't know. good good Prussian
you're doing great.
schooling, right? So maybe one final thought on this as we think about like how this is eventually going to impact the long-term consumer. I think the pharma industry has been extremely well served by trying to take a patient-focused perspective on the development of medicines. And like Jennifer, you were talking about how on Wednesday you guys are doing a patient-focused event. And I think that as medicines, especially these primary preventatives, become more and more a part of our lives, an interesting shift that's going to happen within pharma over the next 20 years is not just taking a patient-centric view, but what I call taking a person-centric view, where you don't pathologize the person. You don't want to pathologize being old, but at the same time, people are taking their health into account and like doing things to optimize their health at levels that we've never seen before. And so without thinking of that person as a patient, can we use our emerging knowledge of biology to help that person optimize their health? And I think that that shift from patient focused to person focused is going to be the shift in an organization that will allow these types of new scientific tools to find their home.
So do you think that also means more knowledge marketing, if you call it, right, to individuals about the things they need to pay attention to versus a talk to your doctor if you don't feel well?
Yeah. Thankfully, no, I don't think that. Like we'll see. Like talk to me in 15 years, and we'll see where we're at. But on the whole, one of the great things about building a therapeutics company as opposed to a supplements company is the fact that our clinical trials come out of our R&D budget, not our marketing budget, and like that. Ultimately, we are going to demonstrate through clinical trials that these things work, not by convincing a bunch of consumers that they need.
Yeah. I think Derek's muted maybe, or
I am. Sorry, there was some noise behind me. I think we can reserve a slot on the show for you guys in 15 years. We have a lot
oh, I'm going to be retired.
We have a lot of great guests lined up, but our pipeline does not extend that far. So Juliette, I think we can give you the option to close here. I would say that why don't you look out at the next kind of 2, 3, 5 years as where you'd like to see the company? Because from my perspective, you guys have done an amazing job with our early capital creation. You've set an incredibly ambitious goal, incredibly ambitious strategy. You're obviously building the company in a great place, and we love to have you here. So let me throw it to you while the noise comes in the background.
Yeah, where do I want the company to be? I mean, I can talk about more. what I would love the impact of the company to be. One is, I think we're doing something different, and it's proving out to be good for the model that we're doing. So I hope that in 2, 3, 5 years that people know what this model is and more companies are doing it. And I hope that the things that we learn is not a secret, and things that we learn are something that we publicly like to talk about, all of our winnings and failings as well. And it's something that I hope many people can say, hey, Cambrian has tried that, it has worked for them, and then we should repeat that in other areas of science, not just biotech, but I mean like climate change, and maybe that is biotech, but wherever we see that there is a bottleneck in scientific progress to reaching the broader society, I hope that Cambrian can be a name that can be brought up and said, they've tried this, let's try it here and see how we can bring about bigger progress in our arena or field of study. So for me, that's like a long-term goal, and hopefully within even 5 years, hopefully that's a reachable destination for us in terms of impact. In the nearer term, I would like for that to then, if I dial it back to maybe 2, 3 years and say, we were able to advance a number of promising therapies in underinvested areas especially, and we're showing a way to do that in a thoughtful, capital efficient, expert-driven manner. And then we're probably able to say we were able to advance these drugs to patients who need them. And then to the last conversation we were just having, really get people thinking differently about how we can live healthfully, and how we as scientific industries as well as society can think about what does being healthy mean, and what can we do today to an individual level and as a government level even to change impact on making sure that people live the high quality of life that everyone deserves. So I hope that our drugs our programs are on their way to do that, and then showing tangible results we can point to and say how we're doing that in 2-3 years.
Thank you. Both Juliette and James, thank you so much for being our guests today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. Your journey is inspiring, and we look forward to witnessing your success right here in New York. Thank you to Pfizer for being our sponsor this month, and we hope to see everyone virtually on Wednesday at our Patient Engagement Summit. Thanks so much, James and Juliette. Everybody have a good day.
Yeah,
Thank you for
you guys were
having us.
great. Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.